under the bright lights of the world's biggest stadiums, the name Zlatan Ibrahimović has become an icon of modern soccer. For more than 2 decades, he scored over 500 goals in his professional career, conquering almost every major tournament in Europe. Zlatan won 4 Serie A titles in Italy, numerous domestic honors with Inter Milan and AC Milan, 4 Ligue 1 titles with Paris Saint-Germain, and many trophies in the Netherlands with Ajax. He was the all-time leading goal scorer for the Sweden national team for many years, with over 60 goals for Sweden. Zlatan also claimed more than 10 Swedish Player of the Year awards, a national record, and made multiple appearances in European Teams of the Year. In 2013, the whole world was stunned when he scored that acrobatic overhead kick from more than 30 meters against the England national team, a goal that later won the FIFA Puskás Award for the best goal of the year. At nearly 40 years old, when many players had already retired, Zlatan still led AC Milan to the Serie A title in the 2020-2022 season, becoming one of the oldest champions in the league's history. To millions of fans, he wasn't just a striker. He was the embodiment of strength, resilience, and unyielding pride. But behind that spotlight is a different story that the world rarely sees. Before becoming a legend, Zlatan was a boy growing up in the tough immigrant neighborhood of Rosengård in Malmö, where violence and despair often outnumbered hope. His parents divorced when he was young. The family was so poor that some days the fridge was completely empty. His father struggled with alcohol and war memories, while his mother worked tirelessly to support the kids. Young Zlatan grew up feeling abandoned, frequently fighting on the streets and learning to defend himself from a very early age. Soccer became the only escape from that chaotic world. But even when he stepped onto the pitch, he carried the anger and loneliness of his childhood with him. That's why, for many years, Zlatan seemed to live 2 lives at once. One that the whole world saw the proud soccer superstar, the man who always said he was a lion. And another, quieter, one the Rosengård kid who never forgot those days of hunger and long nights full of uncertainty. The survival instinct from his childhood turned him into a warrior on the field. And it was also the drive that never let him allow himself to fall, even when the world misunderstood who he really was. If the story of Zlatan Ibrahimovic's turbulent journey makes you think, please hit subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on deep stories about legends who fought to change their fate. Most of the world sees the dazzling stadiums, the glittering trophies, and the goals that amaze the entire planet. But the real story of Zlatan Ibrahimović didn't start there. It started in a place very few soccer fans have ever heard of, Rosengård, a poor suburb in the city of Malmö in southern Sweden. Rosengård wasn't a place of soccer dreams. It was an old immigrant area where gray concrete buildings stood side by side like cold walls. The streets here were often quiet in the morning, but when night fell, the atmosphere grew tense. Many families scraped by day to day, crime and street gangs weren't unfamiliar, and poverty was part of everyday life. In the 1980s and 1990s, Rosengård was seen as one of Malmö's toughest areas, a place where many kids grew up with very few chances to change their fate. It was right here in 1981 that Zlatan Ibrahimović was born. His father, Zlatan Ibrahimović, was a Bosnian immigrant who came to Sweden carrying the heavy memories of the Balkan War. His mother, Durka Gravic, was Croatian, a strong woman but struggling with the harsh life of an immigrant working-class family. Their marriage didn't last long. When Zlatan was still small, they divorced, and from that moment, the boy's world started breaking into pieces. Life in the family's small apartment was often filled with tension and arguments. No stability, no sense of safety, just long days of uncertainty. Money was almost non-existent in the family. Some mornings Zlatan opened the fridge and saw almost nothing inside. Meals were sometimes just the simplest things they could find. For many other kids, Childhood was a time of play and carefreeness, but for Zlatan, childhood was a series of days, learning how to survive in a world where everything could disappear at any moment. The father he loved, Ibrahimović, carried deep wounds from the past. Memories of war, loss, and exile often left him drowning in sadness. Alcohol became the only way for him to escape those memories. Some days he stayed silent for hours. Some nights he drank until he no longer recognized what was happening around him. Meanwhile, Zlatan's mother, Jurka, worked almost non-stop. She cleaned offices, did janitorial work, took any job she could to feed the family. Long shifts meant she was rarely home. When she came back, her body was exhausted from hours of labor, but she still had to keep caring for her children. Her life was a war without gunfire, a fight to keep the family going one more day. But no matter how strong she was, the absence of a complete family still left big gaps in Zlatan's childhood. The boy grew up between two different but equally unstable worlds. At home, he saw his father's sadness and his mother's exhaustion. Out on the streets of Rosengård, he saw other kids like him, kids with few choices. The concrete streets became their playground. The empty lots between buildings turned into makeshift soccer fields. But even there, things weren't simple. Fights, scrapping, small clashes happened all the time. Young Zlatan learned to stand up and never back down. Not because he wanted to be tough, but because in Rosengård, if you didn't protect yourself, no one else would. Some afternoons, as the sun set behind the concrete blocks, Zlatan stood alone with an old ball. He kicked it against the wall over and over, as if trying to release something trapped inside. No coach, no audience, just a boy and a dream that hadn't fully formed yet. But even before he knew what that dream was, soccer became the only place where he felt he belonged to something. The chaos of his family, the poverty of Rosengård, and the loneliness shaped a very complex inner world in that boy. Many years later, when Zlatan became one of the world's most famous players, many people only saw his confidence and big ego. They heard his bold statements and thought that was his true nature. But few knew that pride came from the years when young Zlatan felt he had nothing but the will to survive. The strength the world saw on the pitch was actually formed from the hardest days of his childhood. Rosengård taught Zlatan many things, not with gentle lessons, but with harsh experiences. It taught him that the world could be cold and unfair. It taught him that sometimes you have to carve your own path, even when no one believes you can go far. But, most importantly, Rosengård taught him one thing that later became the foundation of his entire life. If you want to change your fate, you have to fight for it. And the boy Zlatan, even as just a kid in a poor neighborhood, started that fight very early. The cold concrete streets of Rosengård weren't just where Zlatan grew up. They also became the place that taught that boy how to survive. After long days at school, when other kids went home to their families, young Zlatan Ibrahimović often wandered the streets. In Rosengård, the streets weren't safe, but for Zlatan, they were the only place where he could breathe. The empty lots between concrete buildings, the worn-out playgrounds with torn nets and bent goalposts became his world. However, life on those streets was far from easy. To survive in Rosengård, a kid had to learn to be tough. And Zlatan learned that very early. Some days he and the neighborhood kids ran through the narrow alleys, not to play, but to find something for themselves. Zlatan once stole a bike, not because he wanted to be bad, but because in Rosengård, a bike could be the most valuable thing a kid could own. It gave him a sense of freedom, the feeling he could escape the gray concrete walls of the poor neighborhood. But along with those adventures came unavoidable trouble. The police started noticing that tall, skinny boy with stubborn eyes. Clashes with other kids happened often. Fighting became a familiar part of life, not because Zlatan liked violence, but because he understood that if he didn't stand up for himself, no one else would. At school, things weren't much better. The classrooms seemed too small compared to the storm raging inside that Rosengård boy. Zlatan struggled to focus. He didn't like sitting still for hours listening to dry lectures when his mind was full of other thoughts. Many teachers saw him as a problem rather than a student. They saw a troublemaker, a boy who wouldn't follow rules, a pupil they believed would never amount to anything. In the eyes of many adults around him, Zlatan was a hopeless kid, a kid whose future seemed already decided by where he was born. Those judgments weren't always said out loud, but Zlatan could feel them. He saw the teachers' looks when he walked into class. He heard how they talked about him to others. And little by little, those things built a simmering anger inside him. Zlatan didn't know how to express his emotions with words. Instead, he took all that anger and loneliness out onto the soccer field. Soccer started as just a street game. No coach, no tactics, no clear rules. The neighborhood kids simply put down 2 backpacks as goalposts and started playing. But even in those chaotic matches, one thing set Zlatan apart. When he had the ball, the way he moved was like a fight for survival. Every touch was powerful. Every time he beat an opponent felt like a challenge. He didn't play soccer just for fun. He played it like it was the only way out of this place. Other kids had talent too, but Zlatan had something many of them didn't. Anger turned into drive. He ran faster, fought for the ball harder, and never accepted defeat. If someone tried to push him off the ball, he'd come back stronger. If someone said he wasn't good enough, he'd do everything to prove them wrong. Soccer became the only place where he felt he could control something in his life. Many evenings, when the other kids had gone home, Zlatan stayed on the field. He kicked the ball against the wall over and over. The old ball bounced back from the concrete wall, and he kept kicking it, as if pouring out all the emotions he couldn't put into words. In those moments, Rosengård seemed quieter. No more arguing from the cramped apartments. No more distant police sirens. Just the sound of the ball hitting the wall, and the heavy breathing of a boy trying to find meaning in his life. No one in the neighborhood back then thought this kid would become a soccer legend. To them, Zlatan was just another child in the poor immigrant area. One with a lot of energy, a lot of trouble, and maybe too much anger. But deep inside that boy, something was slowly taking shape. Every game on the dirt field, every time he got knocked down and got back up, every skeptical look from the adults, all of it was forging him in a way no one recognized at the time. Rosengård wasn't gentle with Zlatan, but that very harshness taught him an important lesson. If the world sees you as weak, you have to prove the opposite. And the boy Zlatan Ibrahimović, even though he didn't yet know where his future would lead, had started fighting for his life on those concrete streets of the poor neighborhood. The long afternoons on the dusty fields of Rosengård gradually led that boy to a bigger opportunity. After years of playing on the streets, Zlatan Ibrahimovic's natural talent finally caught the eye of local coaches. He was brought into the youth system of the city's biggest club, Malmö's FF. For many other kids, joining a soccer academy was a moment of joy and hope. But for Zlatan, it was a step full of contradictions. Part of him craved this chance, craved escaping the poor streets of Rosengård. But another part felt out of place from the very first day. The other young players came from more stable families. They had parents coming to watch training. They had new soccer boots, neat clothes, and relatively peaceful lives off the field. Zlatan was different. He arrived at training with Rosengård's past still stamped in every gesture. The way he talked, the way he reacted, even the way he walked, carried the defensiveness of a kid used to fighting to protect himself. That made him stand out, but not in the way the coaches wanted. Right from the first training sessions, Zlatan showed exceptional talent. He handled the ball with a confidence rarely seen in a young player. His bold dribbles surprised many teammates, but along with that talent came an uncontrollable personality. Zlatan didn't like being told what to do. If a coach criticized him too harshly, he was ready to fire back. If a teammate tried to clash hard during practice, Zlatan would react immediately. He played soccer the way he had lived on the streets, never backing down, never afraid, and never giving up. That quickly created conflict. Some coaches saw potential in this Rosengård boy, but many others saw a big problem. In professional soccer, discipline is everything, and Zlatan seemed to have little patience for strict rules. There were training sessions where he walked out midway because he felt treated unfairly. There were matches where he argued fiercely with the coach after being substituted. Each time, the gap between Zlatan and the soccer system he was trying to enter grew wider. More than once, Malmö FF's coaching staff considered dropping him from the team. In closed meetings, some said Zlatan was too hard to control. They worried his impulsive nature would ruin not only his own career, but also affect the other players. One coach even said straight to his colleagues, "This kid will destroy himself if he doesn't change." That wasn't malice. It was genuine concern from someone who had seen many young talents lost just because they couldn't control their emotions. Zlatan didn't always hear those judgments directly, but he could feel them. He saw the way some coaches looked at him like they were waiting for his next mistake. That made him even more defensive. Deep down, Zlatan wasn't just fighting to prove he was a good player. He was fighting to prove he deserved to be there. There were days Zlatan left training with a heavy feeling in his heart. He watched the other players chatting happily with coaches or their parents outside the field. As for him, he usually left quietly alone. Those steps took him back to Rosengård, where everything was familiar but also full of hard memories. There, he wasn't a Malmö FF player. He was just Zlatan, the boy who grew up among concrete streets and dreams that hadn't yet taken shape. The feeling of not belonging anywhere started growing inside him. In Rosengård, he was the kid who played soccer differently from those around him. But at Malmö FF, he was the street kid who didn't quite fit into the organized world of soccer. Those two worlds seemed never to meet, and Zlatan stood in the middle, trying to figure out where he really belonged. But right in those years full of conflict, something important was happening that no one noticed. Every time Zlatan was doubted, every time he nearly got dropped from the team, every time he heard words that he would fail, another fire ignited inside him. It was the quiet determination of a kid who was too used to being underestimated. Rosengård had taught Zlatan how to fight, and now, in the professional soccer system, he was learning how to turn that fight into strength. The road ahead was still full of obstacles, but the boy many believed would destroy himself wasn't ready to give up. In fact, he hadn't even really started yet. Those months full of conflict at the academy eventually led Zlatan to an important turning point. After many near drops from the team, Malmö FF's coaching staff began to realize that behind the hot-tempered and hard-to-control personality of that Rosengård boy was a rare talent. Zlatan wasn't like the other young players. He could make mistakes, he could cause trouble, but every time the ball was at his feet, he created things others couldn't. That's why, despite the doubts, Zlatan was given an important chance. He was promoted to Malmö's official youth team. It was the first time in his life he saw a real door opening in front of him, a door leading out of Rosengård. To many, it was just a small step in the soccer development system, but to Zlatan, it felt like an escape from a world that had imprisoned his childhood. For the first time, he started thinking that maybe his life didn't have to end on the gray concrete streets of that poor immigrant neighborhood. Maybe soccer could really take him farther. But along with that new hope came an enormous pressure Zlatan had never experienced before. When he stepped into the Malmö youth team's locker room, Zlatan immediately realized he was different, not just in playing style, but different in the world he came from. Many players on the team came from better-off families. They had parents driving them to training in cars, bringing the latest soccer boots. They talked about family vacations and good schools they attended. Zlatan came from Rosengård. He took the bus or rode an old bike to training. He carried the past of a neighborhood many of them had never even set foot in. The feeling of being out of place appeared quickly. In the locker room, Zlatan often sat quieter than the others. He didn't know how to join their conversations. Sometimes he felt like he was standing on the edge of a world that didn't fully welcome him. No one said it outright, but Zlatan could sense the difference. And for a boy who grew up in an environment where he always had to protect himself, feeling sidelined made him even more defensive. On the training field, things weren't easy either. Soccer at Malmö wasn't like the chaotic street games in Rosengård. Here, there were tactics, discipline, systems. Coaches demanded players move to the right positions, pass at the right moments, follow clear rules. But Zlatan had been shaped by a completely different environment. On Rosengård's concrete streets, he learned to play by instinct. He dribbled when he wanted, shot when he saw a chance, and never feared confronting anyone. Many coaches watched that style and shook their heads. To them, Zlatan was too freestyle, too hard to control. But for Zlatan, that freedom was everything he had. It was the only part of life where he felt truly strong. And every time someone tried to limit it, the anger inside him rose again. There were training sessions where Zlatan argued with coaches. There were matches where he tried to do everything alone just to prove they were wrong to doubt him. Those reactions made many believe even more that this boy was too stubborn to succeed. But what they didn't understand was the root of that stubbornness. For Zlatan, soccer wasn't just a sport, it was the only path he saw to escape Rosengård. If he failed here, he knew full well he'd end up back in the place that had shaped his childhood, where opportunities were rare and the future was often limited by circumstances. That's why every training session for Zlatan felt like a small battle. Every tackle, every shot, every bit of criticism became fuel that made him push harder. The anger that once worried so many people started turning into fuel for him. Zlatan ran faster, trained longer, and never accepted being looked down on. When the other players left the training ground, sometimes he'd stay a bit longer, shooting into an empty net or practicing alone. In those moments, he wasn't the out-of-place kid in the locker room anymore. He was just Zlatan, a boy with a ball and a dream that couldn't be explained in words. Even so, the road ahead was still full of doubt. Many coaches still didn't believe Zlatan could adapt to professional soccer. They saw the talent, but they also saw an uncontrollable personality. And in soccer, sometimes personality can decide a player's fate as much as talent. But Zlatan didn't think much about those judgments. He just knew he had to keep fighting every day, because for him, Malmö wasn't just a soccer club. It was the first door leading out of Rosengård, and Zlatan Ibrahimović, the boy many had seen as not belonging anywhere, was starting to step through that door with all the anger, pride, and survival instinct forged on the poor streets of his childhood. The doors Zlatan had seen at Malmö eventually opened much wider than he ever imagined. After years of proving himself in Malmö FF's youth and first teams, Zlatan Ibrahimovic's extraordinary talent began attracting scouts from across Europe. And then the first big opportunity came. In 2001, Zlatan left Sweden to join one of the world's most famous soccer academies, Ajax. For many young players, that was a dream. Ajax was renowned for developing great stars and opening doors to the top level of European soccer. But for Zlatan, that move wasn't just a career step. It was also a step into a completely unfamiliar world. For the first time in his life, he left Sweden to live in another country. Amsterdam wasn't like Malmö. The historic streets, the quiet canals, people speaking a language Zlatan didn't understand. Everything around him was new. In Malmö, even though life was hard, he knew how to survive. But here, Zlatan felt like a stranger. Language was the first barrier. In the locker room, players chatted in Dutch, and Zlatan often just sat quietly, not because he didn't want to talk, but because he didn't know what to say. Loneliness started creeping into his life. No more familiar streets of Rosengård, no more old friends, no family nearby. Evenings in his small apartment in Amsterdam grew longer. Zlatan often sat alone, thinking about how everything in his life had changed so fast. From a poor kid in an immigrant neighborhood, he was now at one of Europe's biggest clubs. But instead of feeling proud, sometimes he felt more lost than ever. On the field, things weren't easy either. Ajax was a completely different soccer environment from Malmö. Here, tactics came first. Players had to follow a strict system, move to the right positions, think the way the coach demanded. But Zlatan still carried the Rosengård street style-free, instinctive, and sometimes unpredictable. That upset some coaches. They thought he needed more discipline, needed to change his game to fit the team's system. Those criticisms started affecting Zlatan. For the first time in years, he began doubting himself. There were training sessions where nothing seemed to work right. The dribbles that once amazed people were now seen as too risky. Bold decisions on the field were viewed as lacking discipline. In the locker rooms, Zlatan grew even quieter. He felt like he was caught between two worlds, no longer fully belonging to Rosengård, but never truly belonging to Ard, but never truly belonging to Ajax either. There were moments when the thought of quitting soccer crossed his mind, not because he didn't love the sport, but because the pressure and loneliness sometimes became too heavy. Zlatan had thought that leaving Rosengård would make everything easier. But in Amsterdam, he realized escaping the past wasn't that simple. He still carried the old memories, the old wounds, and sometimes they made him feel like he didn't belong anywhere. But then, one moment changed everything. In an Ajax match, Zlatan received the ball near the penalty area. Opposing defenders rushed in to stop him. But, instead of passing as the tactics demanded, he did what he'd always done since his days in Rosengård. Zlatan started dribbling. One defender beaten, then the second, then the third. Every touch was quick and decisive, like a dance born from instinct. When he finally shot the ball into the net, the whole stadium went silent for a moment before exploding. That wasn't just a beautiful goal. It was a statement that Zlatan Ibrahimović didn't need to become a copy of anyone else. His style, different as it was, could still shine at the highest level. From that moment, the way people looked at Zlatan began to change. Ajax fans started talking about him as a special talent. The media started paying attention, and gradually, Zlatan went from a lost immigrant kid to one of the most talked-about young players in Europe. But even as fame started arriving, the loneliness inside Zlatan didn't completely disappear. Off the field, his life remained pretty quiet. Evenings in Amsterdam were often spent in silence and reflection. Zlatan knew he was getting closer to the dream he'd once thought impossible, but deep down, he still carried the feeling that he was an outsider in a strange world. Maybe that's the paradox of Zlatan Ibrahimovic's life. The more famous he became, the more he felt different from those around him. The farther he advanced in his career, the clearer the memories of Rosengård became in his mind. The poor streets of his childhood were still there, as an inseparable part of who he was. And even though Ajax became the place where Zlatan started conquering European soccer, he still carried the familiar feeling from his early years. The feeling that he had to keep fighting not just to win on the field, but to prove he deserved to stand here. After his first seasons at Ajax, the name Zlatan Ibrahimović started appearing more and more in European sports papers. Spectacular goals, bold ball handling, and a personality-filled playing style made him one of the most talked-about young talents of that time. But along with the growing fame, another image also began forming in the eyes of the media and fans. Zlatan wasn't just a talented striker. He was also a controversial figure, a man who said things few players dared to say. a man who always stepped up to the microphone with a confidence that made many people uncomfortable. Zlatan's statements quickly became headlines. He talked about himself like he was the best player in the world. He talked about matches like victory was already decided, and sometimes he said things that left the entire press room silent for a few seconds before the murmurs started spreading. Many journalists called it arrogance. Some coaches thought it was a sign of an oversized ego. In many people's eyes, Zlatan Ibrahimović was becoming the model of an arrogant superstar, a talented player who always wanted to put himself above everyone else. But what very few people understood at the time was that those bold words weren't just confidence. They were part of a persona Zlatan was gradually building for himself. A tough, fearless, almost untouchable outer shell. A character the world would later call the Lion. And behind that shell was a much deeper story, because Zlatan knew very well what it felt like to be underestimated. The boy who grew up in Rosengård had heard too many people say he would fail. He'd seen the doubting looks from teachers, from coaches, from those who didn't believe a kid from a poor immigrant neighborhood could go far. Those memories didn't disappear when Zlatan became a professional player. They were still there, quietly existing in his mind. And in some way, they still shaped how he faced the world. So instead of letting the world keep underestimating him, Zlatan chose a different way. He stepped forward and declared he was the best. He said things that forced people to pay attention. He built an image so strong that no one dared look down on him anymore. To many, that was arrogance. But to Zlatan, it was armor. That armor protected him from old wounds. When he said he was a lion, he wasn't just talking to the press. He was reminding himself that the Rosengård boy had survived too much to be beaten easily. When he walked onto the field with near-defiant confidence, it wasn't just a performance. It was his way of making sure no one could ever make him feel small, like in his childhood years again. His close teammates sometimes understood that better than outsiders did. They saw a different Zlatan in the locker room. Quieter, more observant, and sometimes more reserved than the image the media usually portrayed. They saw a man who always worked hard in training, who refused to accept mediocrity, and who carried a powerful drive that not everyone had. But to most of the world, Zlatan remained the symbol of arrogance. And over time, he even started accepting that persona as part of himself. Because in top-level soccer, image can sometimes matter as much as talent. A striker doesn't just need to score goals. He has to make opponents feel fear before the match even starts. And Zlatan understood that the lion image made many people wary even before he touched the ball. Yet behind all those bold words, behind the confident shrugs and the answers that sparked media debates, there was still a simple truth. Zlatan Ibrahimović wasn't born arrogant. He learned to become strong because life taught him that weakness could get you crushed. That mask of overconfidence wasn't his true nature. It was a shield forged from the tough years in Rosengård. A shield to make sure the boy who once felt lonely and abandoned would never have to feel that way again. And even though the world saw an arrogant Zlatan on the field, very few understood that behind that image was still the Rosengård boy, the one who learned to turn his pain into strength. Zlatan Ibrahimovic's fame continued to grow after his years conquering Europe. From Ajax to successful seasons in Italy, Zlatan proved he wasn't just a lucky street talent. He was one of the world's top strikers. And then, in 2009, the opportunity many players dream of their whole lives finally arrived. Zlatan signed with FC Barcelona, one of the greatest clubs in soccer history. At that time, Barcelona wasn't just strong, they were almost unbeatable. The team had a generation of legendary players, led by the coach hailed as a tactical genius, Pep Guardiola. When Zlatan stepped into Camp Nou, many believed he had reached the peak of his career. For a boy who grew up in Rosengård, putting on the Barcelona jersey seemed like proof that his fight had ended in victory. The first days in Barcelona really felt that way. The massive Camp Nou stadium, the passionate fans, training sessions with the best players in the world. Zlatan scored in his early matches, and everything seemed to be going right. But behind the glamour of that great team, a quiet tension began to form. And over time, that tension turned into a psychological battle that made Zlatan feel like he was stepping into a nightmare. The relationship between Zlatan and Pep Guardiola started out fairly normal. Guardiola demanded absolute discipline from his players. He built a complex tactical system where every player had to perfectly fulfill their role. But Zlatan wasn't a player who easily fit into a mold. His style was born from instinct, from the freedom he once had on Rosengård's streets. He needed space to create, to do the unexpected. And that was exactly what made him gradually feel out of place in Guardiola's system. Over time, the gap between them grew. Guardiola spoke less and less directly to Zlatan. Tactical discussions became short and cold. In the locker room, Zlatan started sensing a change he couldn't quite explain. Big matches came, and sometimes he was substituted earlier than expected. There were games where he wasn't used as much as before. For a player always used to being the center of the match, that felt like a shock. Zlatan began to feel pushed aside. In a team full of stars, he once thought his talent would be respected. But now, he felt like he was standing on the sidelines of a story he once believed he was the main character in. The media started talking about tension between Zlatan and Guardiola. Questions came up in press conferences. And even if he didn't always say it out loud, Zlatan could feel very clearly that his relationship with the coach had cracked. For many other players, that might just be a professional issue. But for Zlatan, it touched something much deeper. The feeling of being abandoned, the feeling of being pushed out without explanation. Those emotions weren't unfamiliar to him. They had existed in the childhood of the Rosengård boy, when his family broke apart and life became chaotic. And now, in one of the world's biggest clubs, Zlatan was feeling something similar again. There were nights after matches, when the stadium lights were off, and everyone had left, that Zlatan sat alone in the locker room or in his apartment, thinking about everything that had happened. He once thought that reaching the top of soccer would make those old feelings disappear. But in Barcelona, he realized the past isn't easily left behind. Fame, money, and goals couldn't erase the memories that had shaped who he was. Things gradually became more tense. Zlatan wasn't someone who stayed silent when he felt treated unfairly, and Guardiola wasn't a coach who liked being challenged. Those two strong personalities ultimately couldn't coexist in the same system. What was once seen as the biggest step forward in Zlatan's career now became a chapter full of conflict. As the season went on, Zlatan understood that his Barcelona dream was slowly coming to an end. The place he once thought would be the peak of his career turned into one of the toughest experiences. But in that adversity, one thing remained unchanged. Zlatan never forgot how to get back up after being knocked down. Because deep down, even as one of the world's most famous players, he still carried the spirit of the Rosengård boy. The boy who learned to fight when everyone thought he had no chance. And if Barcelona had become a new battle in Zlatan's life, he would face it the only way he knew how, with unyielding will. After those tense months at Barcelona, Zlatan Ibrahimovic's journey took another turn. For many players, leaving FC Barcelona might be seen as a step back, but for Zlatan, it was a chance to start over. He returned to Italy and joined Inter Milan during an important phase of his career. There, Zlatan rediscovered the familiar feeling he once had, the feeling of being the center of the match, the one who could change the outcome with a single moment of genius. The goals started coming again. The bold ball handling made fans stand and applaud. Zlatan became the name defenders feared every time they stepped onto the field. In Italy, fans loved strong, charismatic strikers, and Zlatan was almost born for that environment. He didn't just score goals, he scored goals people talked about for years. Volleys from tough angles, dribbles past multiple defenders, powerful shots like hammers. Zlatan wasn't just a striker, he was a performance, and when he walked onto the field, it felt like anything could happen. But Zlatan's journey didn't stop there. After successful years in Italy, he moved to France to join Paris Saint-Germain, a club starting to build ambitions to become a major European force. Right from his first season, Zlatan became the soul of the team. He scored relentlessly, led PSG to domestic titles, and quickly turned Ligue 1 into his personal stage. For many seasons, Zlatan nearly dominated the league. His goals came at an astonishing rate. His bold moves left opposing defenders helpless, and gradually a nickname spread across France, the King of Ligue 1. PSG fans chanted his name in the Parc des Princes stands. The media praised him as one of the greatest strikers of his generation. The statistics backed it up. Hundreds of career goals, back-to-back domestic titles. Zlatan Ibrahimović had become a symbol of dominance on the field. To many fans, he was the image of absolute confidence, a player who stepped onto the pitch believing the match was already his. But Zlatan's life off the field wasn't always like that image. After big matches, when the fans had left the stadium and the lights dimmed, Zlatan often returned home in quiet. Nights in Paris weren't always filled with celebration. Sometimes they were just quiet moments, when he sat alone and thought about the path that had brought him here. In those moments, memories of Rosengård often came back, the concrete streets, the afternoons playing on dirt fields, the days when the future seemed limited by circumstances. Even after passing through many major European cities, wearing the jerseys of great clubs and scoring in front of millions, a part of Zlatan always belonged there. Rosengård wasn't just where he was born. It was where it shaped who he became. Maybe that's why, even as one of the world's most famous players, Zlatan still carried a certain sense of loneliness. Not loneliness in the sense of lacking people around him. He had teammates, fans, and millions following him worldwide. But deep down, Zlatan still felt different. Different from many players who grew up in more stable environments, he carried memories not everyone understood. Sometimes, in the rare interviews where he talked about his childhood, people could see a different Zlatan, quieter, more thoughtful. A man who understood that victories on the field couldn't completely erase the marks of the past. The titles, the goals, the applause from the stands, all of it was real, but none of it changed where he had started. And maybe that was the paradox of Zlatan Ibrahimović during the peak years of his career. On the field, he was the king, a striker the whole of Europe had to acknowledge. But when night fell and the cheers died down, he was still the Rosengård boy in his own memories. A boy who once had to fight to survive, who was doubted, who felt out of place in the world around him. That very memory became Zlatan's source of strength. It reminded him that everything he had today wasn't a given. Every goal, every title, every round of applause from the crowd was the result of a long journey full of challenges. And no matter what the world called him, the king of Ligue 1 or one of Europe's greatest strikers, Zlatan Ibrahimović still knew his story began in a very different place. A poor neighborhood where a boy first learned to fight for his life. The glorious years on the field took Zlatan Ibrahimović through many of Europe's major cities, from Amsterdam, Turin, Milan to Paris. His life seemed forever tied to dazzling stadiums, spectacular goals, and media praise. But amid all that glory, one person entered Zlatan's life in a very different way. Not as a fan, not as a journalist or an agent. It was the woman who later became the most important support in his life, Helena Sager. Helena Sager didn't come into Zlatan's life as part of the soccer world. She was an independent, intelligent, and successful Swedish woman in business. When they first met in Malmö in the early 2000s, Zlatan was still just a young player starting his career in Europe. And from the beginning, Their relationship was different from the typical love stories in the world of sports stars. Helena was much older than Zlatan, had her own career, and wasn't easily impressed by fame or his bold words. While many saw Zlatan as a rising superstar, Helena saw something else. She saw the real person behind the mask. Not the lion the press often talked about. Not the superstar who always appeared with near-defiant confidence toward the world. Helena saw a man carrying many wounds from the past. A man who had learned to build his strength from the tough years in Rosengård. And because she understood that, Helena never tried to change Zlatan. She simply stood by his side, as a calm presence in his always turbulent life. During the years Zlatan conquered Europe's major tournaments, Helena always kept a certain distance from the media spotlight. She rarely appeared at the glamorous events of the soccer world. Instead, she chose a private life, focusing on family and her own career. That sometimes surprised people. In a world where many soccer stars were constantly surrounded by public attention, Zlatan and Helena's relationship carried an unusual quietness. That very quietness became what Zlatan needed most. After big matches, after tense press conferences, after criticism or praise from the media, he always had a place to return to. Not a stadium, not a locker room, but a home where he could set aside the superstar image for a while. There, Zlatan wasn't a soccer icon. He was just a man, a partner. When their two sons were born, Maximilian and Vincent, Zlatan's life began to change in a deeper way. For the first time, he clearly felt what it meant to be a father. Evenings at home playing with the kids, or simply watching them grow up, brought him a feeling soccer could never give. In his children's eyes, Zlatan wasn't a legend, wasn't the lion. He was just dad. That made him think more about his own life. Zlatan understood that his childhood wasn't easy. He grew up in a broken family, in a neighborhood where opportunities were rare and the future often unclear. But when he saw his own children growing up in a more stable environment, he began to realize he had truly broken that cycle. The years of fighting on the field hadn't just brought fame or titles. They had given him the chance to create a different life for his family. Helena played a big role in that. She wasn't just Zlatan's partner. She was the one who kept his life balanced. When the soccer world became chaotic, when media pressure and fan expectations grew heavy, Helena kept their family in a peaceful space. She understood that behind Zlatan's strong image was still the Rosengård boy who once felt lonely and abandoned. And she always reminded him that he no longer had to fight alone. Maybe that's why, even though Zlatan could step onto the field with confidence that made the whole world take notice, his private life carried a completely different color. There were no shocking statements, no dramatic celebrations. Just family, quiet dinners, and simple moments that a man who grew up in poverty understood the value of more than anyone. And in some way, Helena Sager was the only one who saw through the mask Zlatan had built over many years. She saw the man behind the legend, the man who still carried memories of Rosengård, but now no longer had to face them alone. Family had become his refuge, a place no title, no goal, no fame could replace. The years in Paris had elevated Zlatan Ibrahimović to near-legendary status in European soccer. But time doesn't stop for anyone, not even the greatest players. After leaving Paris Saint-Germain, Zlatan entered a new chapter in his career when he joined Manchester United in 2016. That move made many people curious. At 35, many players were already thinking about ending their careers or moving to less competitive leagues. But Zlatan had never been one to follow the usual path. He arrived in England with the same familiar declaration. He still had a lot to prove. Zlatan's first season at Manchester United quickly proved he hadn't declined at all. He scored consistently, becoming a key factor in the team. His goals helped the club win important titles like the League Cup and Europa League. At an age when many players slowed down, Zlatan still played with the intensity of a warrior. Fans at Old Trafford quickly fell in love with him. They saw in Zlatan not just a talented striker, but a spirit that never gave up. But then one night in April 2017, everything changed. It was the Europa League match between Manchester United and Anderlecht. The game entered its tense final minutes. Zlatan was still running non-stop, still fighting for every ball like he always had throughout his career. And then the fateful moment happened. In an aerial challenge, Zlatan jumped to meet the ball. When he landed, his knee bent at an unnatural angle. Immediately, Zlatan went down on the field. It wasn't the normal fall of a player after a collision. This time, something was different. He lay still for a few seconds, hands on his knee. Old Trafford Stadium, usually filled with wild cheers, suddenly fell strangely silent. Teammates rushed over. Medical staff hurried onto the pitch. Zlatan tried to stand up, but he couldn't. His knee no longer responded like before. Eventually, he had to leave the field with help from the medical team. The image of Zlatan Ibrahimović slowly walking off the pitch under Old Trafford's lights made many people uneasy. For those who had followed soccer long enough, they knew moments like that often didn't signal anything good. The medical diagnosis came right after. Zlatan had torn his anterior cruciate ligament, ACL, one of the most serious injuries for a soccer player. For many young players, this injury was already a huge challenge. But for a 36-year-old player, it was almost a career-ending sentence. Doctors told Zlatan straight what many didn't dare say publicly. At his age, returning to the top level after this injury was nearly impossible. Some in the soccer world even believed it was the end for a legend. The media started asking, was this Zlatan Ibrahimovic's last match? Many fans, though reluctant to admit it, began thinking they might have witnessed the final chapter of a great career. But for Zlatan, that moment wasn't just a physical injury. It was a much deeper challenge. Throughout his life, he had been used to fighting against the limits others placed on him. From the days in Rosengård, when many believed a boy from a poor immigrant neighborhood wouldn't go anywhere. From the early years of his career, when coaches doubted his discipline. And now, at 36, when his body was seriously damaged, the world was once again doubting that his journey had ended. The days after the surgery were the hardest. Zlatan was no longer the man who stepped onto the field in front of tens of thousands of fans. He became a patient in the rehabilitation room. Painful exercises replaced soccer training sessions. Slow, cautious steps replaced the sprints that once terrified opposing defenders. But if there was one thing Zlatan Ibrahimović had never lacked, it was willpower. And when the doctors said his career might be over, a part of Zlatan, the part shaped by the streets of Rosengård, woke up again. Because for Zlatan, life had never been easy, and if his body had been broken that night at Old Trafford, he still wasn't ready to accept that his story was finished. But if there was one thing Zlatan Ibrahimović had proven throughout his entire life, it was that he never accepted the limits others set for him. After the serious ACL injury in 2017 at Manchester United, many medical experts believed his career was over. At 36, returning to top-level play after such an injury was almost impossible. But Zlatan never saw the world the way most people did. When the doctors said he might never come back the same, his reaction wasn't acceptance. His reaction was silence. Then he started fighting. The knee surgery took place under massive attention from the soccer world. But the surgery was only the first step. The real difficulty began afterward. The long months of rehabilitation were filled with painful exercises that sometimes made many players quit halfway. Zlatan, who was once used to covering dozens of meters in seconds, now had to relearn the basic movements of his body. The first steps after surgery were slow and heavy. There were days when the pain came back fiercely. There were rehab sessions that lasted hours and left his body exhausted. But Zlatan was no stranger to pain. From Rosengård to the world's biggest stadiums, his life had always been tied to battles. And this time, the opponent wasn't an opposing defender. The opponent was his own body. In the rehab room, there were no fans, no stadium lights. Just Zlatan, the training equipment, and an unyielding will. After many months of training, what many thought was impossible started to happen. Zlatan returned to the field. His comeback stunned the entire soccer world. And when his journey continued in the United States with LA Galaxy, Zlatan once again proved he wasn't an ordinary player. Right in his debut match, he scored a long-range goal that made the Los Angeles crowd jump to their feet. That shot was like a statement to the whole world. Zlatan Ibrahimovic's story wasn't over yet. The seasons in MLS quickly became a colorful new chapter in his career. Zlatan scored spectacular goals, showed creative touches, and brought huge draw to the league. But for Zlatan, America wasn't the final stop. Even nearing 40, he still felt there was something unfinished in Europe. So in 2019, Zlatan returned to Italy, joining AC Milan. When the deal was announced, many thought it was just a symbolic return, a legend coming back to end his career beautifully. But Zlatan didn't return to Milan to be a symbol. He returned to fight. At that time, AC Milan was going through a difficult period. The club that had once been one of Europe's greatest powers was struggling to find its identity again, and Zlatan, nearing 40, became an inspiration for the whole team, not just with his goals, but with the spirit he brought into the locker room. Young players looked at him and saw a man who had been through everything in soccer yet still played with the hunger of a young man. The 2020-2022 season became the clearest proof of that. Under Zlatan's spiritual leadership, AC Milan gradually climbed back into the Serie A title race. It was a long and challenging journey. But in the end, Milan achieved what many once thought impossible. They won the Serie A title. When the trophy was lifted, Zlatan Ibrahimović was nearly 40 years old. To many, it was just another title in a great players' collection. But for those who understood Zlatan's story, that moment carried much deeper meaning. A boy who once grew up in poverty in Rosengård. A player once doubted for his hot temper. A man who once heard doctors say his career might be over. And now, at an age when many players had left the field, Zlatan still stood there a champion. That wasn't just a team's victory. It was a victory of will. Once again, Zlatan Ibrahimović had proven he wasn't someone who easily faded from the world soccer stage. After the emotional Serie A title with AC Milan, the image of Zlatan Ibrahimović standing among his teammates, long hair tied back, eyes still shining with that familiar confidence, became one of the iconic moments of modern soccer. To the world, Zlatan was always the lion, a larger-than-life figure, a man with bold statements, unimaginable goals, and a personality that made entire stadiums pay attention every time he stepped out. But when the stadium lights went out, when the cheers faded, Zlatan's life took on a very different color, because behind that legendary image was a man who preferred quiet far more than the world imagined. Zlatan had never been one to chase lavish parties or flashy lifestyles like many other sports stars. Instead, most of his time off the field revolved around family where he could set aside the lion image and simply be himself. In his home, Zlatan wasn't a soccer superstar. He was a father. His two sons, Maximilian and Vincent, grew up in a completely different environment from his childhood in Rosengård. Zlatan was always very aware of that. He knew he had gone through a tough childhood days with an empty fridge, streets where a boy had to learn to protect himself from a very early age. That's why, when he saw his own children growing up in a more stable setting, he understood that his years of fighting had brought something more valuable than any title. People close to him often said that when he was with his kids, Zlatan became a completely different person. Less loud, less showy, and even humorous in a very simple way. He loved taking them to sports practice, playing ball with them, or just spending time at home. In those moments, there were no stadiums, no tens of thousands of fans, no pressures of professional soccer. Just a family. By his side, through all those years, was still Helena Sager, the woman who had seen the real person behind Zlatan's mask from the very beginning. Helena never tried to make herself part of the glamorous world soccer brought. She kept her life private, focusing on family and her own career. And perhaps that was exactly what helped Zlatan stay balanced in a life constantly pulled toward the media spotlight. What's notable is that throughout his career, spanning more than 2 decades, Zlatan almost never got caught up in major off-field scandals. In a soccer world where many stars frequently appeared in the papers for scandals or personal controversies, Zlatan's private life remained fairly discreet. He might stir debate with strong statements to the media, but his personal life rarely became tabloid fodder. Instead, Zlatan spent most of his time on simpler things. He loved training, keeping his body in top shape even in the later years of his career. He liked reading books, playing sports, and sometimes just enjoying quiet moments with his family. Those who knew Zlatan often said that was the real him, a man who didn't need stadium lights to feel valuable. Perhaps the most interesting thing about Zlatan Ibrahimović is the contrast between his two worlds. On the field, he was a near-mythical figure, a man who could score unimaginable goals and make statements that caught the world's attention. But off the field, he was a fairly private man, a devoted father, and a loyal partner. And perhaps after all those years of fighting, from Rosengård to the world's biggest stadiums, Zlatan had found what he truly needed. Not fame, not media praise, but a place to come back to. A family. That was where the lion no longer had to roar to prove his strength. There, Zlatan Ibrahimović was simply a human being, a man who had gone through an entire life of battles, and finally found peace in the simplest things. The final years of Zlatan Ibrahimovic's career made many people start looking back at his entire journey with a different perspective. For many years, the media and fans often said Zlatan was like living two lives. One life on the field where he was an icon, a superstar, the lion who made the whole world take notice. And another life, behind the lights where he lived, more discreetly, less noisily, attached to family and simple things. But when looking deeper into Zlatan's story, the truth about his double life wasn't quite like many people imagined. Zlatan never lived two secret lives. There isn't one Zlatan on the field and a completely different Zlatan off it. There aren't two separate people. The truth is much deeper, because Zlatan's two lives aren't really two different worlds. They are two parts of the same person. The first part is the person the whole world knows. The soccer icon, one of the greatest strikers of his generation. The man who conquered many of Europe's major tournaments. The one who wore the jerseys of top clubs like Ajax, Inter Milan, Paris Saint-Germain, Manchester United, and AC Milan. A player who scored hundreds of goals, won countless titles, and created moments that fans will talk about for years to come. That's the Zlatan the world sees. The man who steps onto the field with confidence that makes entire stadiums shake. But alongside that person, there has always been another part inside Zlatan. The Rosengård boy. The boy who grew up in the poor immigrant neighborhood in Malmö. The boy who went to bed with an empty fridge. The boy who learned to fight on the streets before he learned to play soccer on the field. The boy who heard many people say he wouldn't amount to anything in life. That boy never disappeared, even when Zlatan scored the most beautiful goals of his career. Even when tens of thousands of fans chanted his name. Even when he lifted the biggest European championship trophies, a part of him was still that Rosengård boy. Maybe that's exactly why Zlatan always carried such fierce confidence. Because for him, every match wasn't just a game. It was like a battle to prove that the boy once seen as having no future was wrong. When Zlatan made defiant statements to the media, it wasn't just arrogance. It was the voice of the Rosengård boy protecting himself from a world that once doubted him. But at the same time, that very boy also made sure Zlatan never forgot where he came from. Even after passing through Europe's biggest cities, even after living in glorious stadiums, he still carried the memories of the streets where everything began. And maybe those memories helped him stay balanced in life. Because without the Rosengård boy, there would be no Zlatan Ibrahimović as the world knows him today. Those two people, the soccer superstar and the poor boy from Malmö, don't exist separately. They exist together. When Zlatan steps onto the field, the world sees the legend. But deep inside, his drive still comes from those ancient memories. From the days when soccer wasn't about fame or money, but simply a way to survive. And that's the truth about Zlatan Ibrahimovic's double life. Not two secret lives, but two parts of the same story. A man who went very far from where he was born, but never truly left it. And as Zlatan Ibrahimovic's long story gradually approaches its final chapters, the soccer world begins to look back at the entire journey of the man who made millions of fans leap from their seats for more than 2 decades. It was a journey through Europe's greatest stadiums, unimaginable goals, bold statements, and a personality so strong that it sometimes made the whole world argue. But when all the media noise dies down, when the stadium lights go out, what's left isn't just titles or beautiful goals. What's left is the story of a human being. Zlatan Ibrahimović was never the most humble player in soccer history. He never tried to build an image of a perfect man. On the contrary, Zlatan always stepped in front of the world with a strong personality, sometimes defiant, sometimes controversial. He said things many other players would never dare say. He walked onto the field with confidence that made opponents feel pressure even before the match started. And because of that, Zlatan wasn't always loved by everyone. But if you only look at Zlatan through his bold statements or the lion image the media often mentions, you'll miss the most important part of the story. Because behind all of that is a journey of survival. A journey that began in a poor neighborhood in Malmö, where a boy had to learn to fight from a very early age. That boy grew up in Rosengård, where opportunities were few and the future was often limited by circumstances. He saw paths to failure right in front of him. He lived in a broken family, in an environment many believed he would never escape. But Zlatan refused to accept the story the world had written for him. Soccer became the only path he could see, not because he dreamed of becoming a superstar, but because it was the only way to escape a life he didn't want. On Rosengård's concrete streets, he learned to fight for every smallest chance. And when he stepped into the professional soccer world, that spirit never left him. From Ajax to Inter Milan, from Paris Saint-Germain to Manchester United, and finally AC Milan, Zlatan Ibrahimović didn't just score goals. He left his mark everywhere he went, not just with talent, but with will. Because maybe what makes Zlatan special isn't just his soccer skills. Many talented players have appeared in the history of this sport, but not everyone carries a story like Zlatan's. A story about turning the wounds of the past into strength. A story about refusing to let circumstances decide one's fate, even when his body started turning against him. When the serious injury at Manchester United made many believe his career was over, Zlatan stood up once more. He came back, scored, fought, and even lifted the Serie A trophy with AC Milan at nearly 40 years old. To many, that was almost impossible. But for Zlatan Ibrahimović, life never followed ordinary rules. And that may be his greatest legacy. Not the number of goals, not the titles, not the genius moments that made entire stadiums explode, but the story of a boy who survived. a boy not born into privilege, not shielded from life's hardships, but who learned to stand up, fight, and step out of the darkness. Because the truth is, some legends are born under stadium lights. They grow up in favorable environments, get guided from an early age, and the path to glory seems prepared in advance. But there are other legends too. Those who have to fight for every step. Those who have to overcome years when the world believed they would fail. Those who carry their past like a scar and turn it into strength. Zlatan Ibrahimović belongs to the second group. He never ran from his past. He carried it his whole life. Carried Rosengård, carried the boy who once had to fight on poor streets. And in some way, he turned all of it into strength. Strength to stand before the whole world and say, "My story wasn't written for me. I wrote it myself." The story of Zlatan Ibrahimović leaves a very special feeling, both admiration and heartache. When looking back at that entire journey, people don't just see one of the world's greatest strikers, but also the image of a child who grew up in poverty in Rosengård, where the fridge was empty for many days. The father drowned in alcohol in the pain of the Balkan War, and the mother worked long hours as a cleaner to support the children. Those details in the story make readers realize that behind the proud, the lion image is a childhood full of wounds. When Zlatan moved to Ajax and felt isolated in a foreign country, or when he was pushed to the sidelines at FC Barcelona in conflict with Pep Guardiola, we see clearly that the Rosengård boy was always there, still feeling abandoned. And the peak of that pain was the night in 2017 at Manchester United, when his knee tore the ACL, and doctors said his career might be over. But what makes this story powerful isn't the tragedy, but the way Zlatan rose after it. He had surgery, endured months of painful rehab, then returned to win Serie A with AC Milan at nearly 40. For Americans, a society that values personal grit and second chances, Zlatan's story is a reminder that circumstances don't decide fate. Many kids growing up in tough neighborhoods in Chicago, Detroit, or Los Angeles can see themselves in that Rosengård boy long ago. The deepest lesson isn't in Zlatan's goals, but in his will. The past can leave scars, but if a person is strong enough, those very scars can become the source of strength to change a life. If the story of Zlatan Ibrahimovic's extraordinary resilience has touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like to honor the journey of the Rosengård boy who rose to become a soccer legend. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video where we'll continue to explore the real stories behind the legends of the world.